good evening, good morning, whatever time you're listening to this.
Since we're like such an international podcast.
Yes, the estranged industrial complex, audio industrial complex. Well, what time is it here? It's like 3:30 p.m.
Yeah, something like that.
I'm still I'm still drinking my morning coffee. I haven't finished it yet. It's been a slow day. We are re-recording this episode of the podcast.
Maybe for the better.
Yeah, I felt like we recorded it really late after we got back from a restaurant the other day. So we may not have been on form, but maybe we're going to be less on form today.
Yeah, because the second time is farce. And
first is tragedy, then is farce.
Yeah.
Who was it? Is that Marx who said that? I mean, who said it originally? It's obviously the title of a Zizek book.
I'm not sure actually who said that. I think it's actually not like a good guy, not like a philosopher that is like kind of like we agree with. I think it's somebody
maybe
else.
Like it's been cited a number of times, but I swear there's something to do with Marx in relation to it. I don't know, not an expert.
Yeah.
We were just in the middle of a conversation about Taylor Swift, and then we pressed record. So I don't know if you want to go there or not. Hot take central.
We'll leave it to nature. Like if it happens.
If it happens, it happens.
Yeah.
Yes, if it happens, it happens. Adrian was in an Uber last night and sent me a video of. I was like, I was in bed. It was midnight, and you sent me a text saying, "Listen to this shit," and it was the monotone chorus of a Taylor Swift song. Not that that's fine, but it is just quite funny as soon as you notice the.
Yeah.
You can't unnotice it.
Well, do you think that maybe there's something about millennials that they just want to sound like they're stuck in one note?
Ooh. Sometimes the cigar is just a cigar. I don't know. I mean, there's this whole thing about
but it's all over the place.
Apparently that song is called Style, Taylor Swift song. Apparently it's the most averaged song. Mm-hmm. So I mean, I guess you'd know more about this than me, but it's the song, some scientist did a statistical, or a mathematician did a statistician did a statistical analysis of pop songs and how to predict what pop song's going to be successful. And apparently there's a correlation between a hit and how averaged it is, as in like how many different genres are contained within it.
How easy it is to remember.
Mm-hmm. So Taylor Swift obviously has like pop, and then she has like country originally. She has all these different like influences.
Yeah, I don't know. This sounds like justification to me.
Yeah, I watched this BBC documentary a few years ago. They like tried to produce an averaged song, but they couldn't get it averaged enough, and it wasn't very good and it didn't really work. But apparently, that's the song around which all averaged songs, not as in average, but averaged. So like. Yeah. I don't know what a good analogy would be, but there's this thing that you can see on the internet where they look at averaged faces. Mm-hmm. So, and averaged faces look really, really, really attractive. So it's like, this is what the average person from X country looks like, and they just pile on top of each other.
Oh, right.
They blend together hundreds and hundreds of faces of a woman, and the averaged face looks incredible. And when I saw that, I was like, wow, everyone's so hot. But it's actually just because...
Everyone's so hot.
And actually, the English one looked really attractive. But... I think it's just because it's just everything melded together and you get no outliers.
Yeah, did you see that? I don't know if it was the New York Times or something like that, that they did this sort of like digital mesh of different people to see what would the average person look like in like 80 years from now or something like that. It might have been less. But it was just like this kind of like weird, kind of like, I don't know. I would say it's like somewhere in between like an Ethiopian woman and maybe a little bit of Asian there, and then just like
like
Nordic.
as in a kind of like global person.
A global person, yeah.
I didn't see that name.
Yeah, I can't believe you haven't seen it. It was like really going all over the place.
No, I didn't see that. I'll have to look. Interesting. Yeah. Interesting.
It was I think it's a good looking human. I think.
Human. Yeah. Interesting. I'll check it out. So today we are going to talk about the film Blade Runner 2049. And we did this podcast already.
From our second daddy.
Yes. The man that can do no wrong as a filmmaker. Yeah, words do not begin to describe how good his films are. Yeah. How not good, how amazing.
And very deep. They're like deep cuts.
Yeah. I don't know. Incendie, just I can't even speak. It's so good. Yeah.
You're speechless.
I am speechless. Our friend actually just discovered that he's going to be in the Dune movie, which is quite exciting. You predicted this the other day. You were like, "Oh, I wondered, has David got a role?"
Yeah, I was freaking out when he said it. I mean, I was like really, really excited that he's going to be in that. Actually, he's trending pretty hard right now. I was on
really well.
I was on Reddit, and there's he has a picture of him, and then the announcement. Mm-hmm. I think it has like 8,000 likes, which is a lot.
The front page of Reddit was on the
yeah. Well, it's
I'm really excited for him.
Just like the movies subreddit, but it had a lot of likes, and people were like really talking really highly of him.
Just so good to work with. Yeah. Such a good artist. Yeah, he's a fantastic person.
Great look.
Yeah, he has a very amazing screen presence, and he's a kind of, I guess, like character actor, but. I don't actually know. I never watched the original Dune, so I don't know what the character is he's playing, but it's exciting. And we just cannot get enough of Denis Villeneuve. So.
Yeah, I think he's playing sort of. I don't remember exactly who it is, but I think it's sort of like the right-hand man of the main bad guy.
Okay.
But just like this really psychotic person that very sadistic.
Mm-hmm. He tends to play crazy, but I guess. In Making Love, he was a neurotic rather than a psychotic.
Yeah.
Yes. So we came up with a number of themes last time in relation to this film, and I've written them down. One of them is dystopia. My disjoined iPhone notes. Dystopia. You had a great insight about dystopia, so it'll be really fun to get into that. And then
it's nice that you took the notes, because I can't even remember what I had for breakfast yesterday. Like, I have such terrible memory. I really don't remember a lot of the things that we said, but now that...
Don't give me too much credit, because I'm such a disorganized person. I think maybe because I'm so disorganized, I have to be like, write it down.
No, but it's coming back to me now.
And we talked about fantasy. You had a really great point about the character Joi. Mm-hmm. We talked about contingency. This kind of thematic structure of the first Blade Runner compared to this Blade Runner, and how that compares to the 1980s versus the 2010s. And then we also... You
want to start with that? I think that's a good place to start.
So this is all you. I don't think I had that many good insights last time, but you came up with a really good point about how I actually shouldn't say it because I'm like stealing your words. So
no, but it's I think that to me what's interesting, and maybe it has something to do with how we experience reality as millennials as opposed to baby boomers, but it's like the first Blade Runner is about a human that has a hunch that maybe he's a replicant, and the new Blade Runner is about a replicant that has a hunch that he might be human. I don't know. I think that maybe there's something there that kind of reversal is about something.
Yeah, it's almost, and this was, again, we've talked about this before, about like 68, and like that's a kind of baby boomer. I don't want to say revolutionary period, because I don't think it's ended up in revolution at all, but protest period. But there has been some constructive change as well. Don't want to throw it all out. But yeah, the idea was that being a pervert was the ultimate anti-capitalistic move. And so it's like how to get out of the capitalist system by being different.
Sure.
And so, yeah, the film is about a person who appears to be a human who he doesn't want to, but who has a hunch that he's something different.
Yeah.
And this film is about an alienated individual.
Yeah.
As in a replicant wanting to just be normal, to be a person.
Yeah.
Again, I think there's something to that. I mean,
possessed by labor.
Yes, he's like the proletarian who just wants in.
Yeah. That's so sad. But
there's something to that.
We talked a little bit about this, of how he goes to get sort of like checkups. I'm guessing they're like testing his OS or whatever. But they tell him it's not a question, but it's something that resembles sort of a question, because it has a second part that it's kind of like dictated as an answer. But he's given both So that's the test. Like he's been like, the part where cells interlinked and all that.
Yeah, between cells interlinked.
So it gives him a sort of question and the answer as well. So he has absolutely no agency, which is like, also a concept that we talked about in the second episode. The whole agency thing with Hereditary. But yeah, I think that's a very interesting sort of mark of the oppressive certainty that sometimes I think a lot of people our age might feel.
Do you know, it's interesting because there's a psychoanalytic insight about achieving the lost object, which is this ultimate fantasy of kind of returning to this womb-like state pre-language and having this, inciting the desire of your primary caregiver. And at this time pre-language, I've just had a nephew, and it's interesting watching him. It's like the child doesn't know what it wants, it cries, and the mother tells him, "You're hungry, eat."
Yep.
So he doesn't have any agency, and we try by attempting to achieve the lost object to return to a state of no agency. But we don't want no agency either, you know? So as an alienation, as a, whether we're talking about a lot in this podcast, being a millennial and being estranged as such, and all these factors that have compounded silently over the years and accumulated in relation to labor and being young, and all these factors whereby numerically perhaps we are at a point of less than zero in terms of debts and low wages and opportunities.
Isn't it also kind of parallel to this idea, the whole identity politics thing is trying to, I mean, mistakenly I think, trying to prop up the idea of the particular and trying to kind of like maybe humanize oneself through these like particular identities?
Well, it's interesting because there's a very like dialectical bothness to identity politics in relation to how one defines oneself. Being unique, but being unique through certain universals. So saying like, as a female, XYZ, all these kind of, so defining oneself as a unique constellation of commonalities, rather than being unique in your universality. Yeah, no,
and I think what I'm saying is that like there's identity politics maybe are a sort of like compensatory mechanism.
Yeah, okay.
Because of the estrangement that we feel with labor.
So it's almost like a desperation to define.
Exactly.
Yeah. Well, it's interesting because labor under capitalism can be identity. You know, we talked about this in terms of La La Land, that we often define ourselves by our work. We spend the majority of our lives working. And you were talking about love as well. We often now relate to each other in terms of, well, we commodify our position within the capitalist system to sell ourselves as an object to be loved by somebody else.
Yeah.
But yeah, you're not even having one of the first questions you might ask somebody is at a party, what do you do?
Yeah.
It's always one of the first questions we ask, even though potentially it's quite rude. Not even having a labor identity, we define ourselves by all these different factors. And this desperation for definition and delineation. You were telling me that you spoke to a psychoanalyst recently who said that 90% of the people he sees now are psychotics.
Yeah.
And in the part, like 20 years ago, it was neurotics. It seems insane that there's...
Yeah, it was on a Facebook group, and the analyst was talking about it used to be, maybe talking about 68 analysts, that a lot of people that came to see analysts were neurotics. But now that there's some sort of like poverty of neurotics, and that a lot of people, most of the people that go to psychoanalysts are psychotics. I mean, maybe...
It seems a crazy number. But I guess, structurally I can kind of understand it. I mean, there's things like people are more aware of apparently, mental health issues and certain symptoms that might drive a person who is potentially psychotic to a therapist or a psychoanalyst. But yeah, the idea of delineating oneself, obviously a symptom can kind of be an emergent of anything.
Yeah.
So just because one is trying to delineate in a given way doesn't mean that one is psychotic. But it is interesting that this bordering, this seeking to participate, or, often kind of a psychotic thing is to create structure to be able to live in the world, find a way of being in the world, create certainty and delineation and absolutes. Yeah. And almost as neurotic wants can maybe want to be consumed by something. It's like the opposite of that.
Yeah. And I think also, it might be kind of like an interesting statistic, even though it's not official, but sadly, people that are going to get into psychoanalysis are probably of better means. Absolutely. Middle class or high middle class, high class. So it might have to do with a shift in the sort of the psychological structure that people have within that context.
Interesting.
But and I was talking about like sort of like the surplus of identity politics that we have, trying to cover over the fact of or trying to cover over our estrangement from that comes from labor. One of the reasons why I don't think that works is, and this is something that is very sort of Freudian thing, maybe even a little bit Hegelian, that we're not identical to ourselves. So
absolutely. This idea. I mean, we quoted this line from Hegel in Making Love, but the mysteries of the Egyptians, the mysteries of the Egyptians themselves, it's almost by dint of seeking to delineate yourself, it almost exemplifies the fact that you don't know yourself and you can never really know yourself. So
sexuality, and this goes back to another example that we need to talk about. Sexuality is sort of the breeding ground of antagonism when it comes to who we are not. And there's this beautiful example in the film that immediately when I saw it, I was like, okay, this is the perfect sort of like representation of what antagonism means, and it comes from the missing sort of elements when it comes to our desires and our fantasies. So what happens in the film is that what's the guy's name? Ryan Gosling. He has this sort of hologram girlfriend that is custom made for his desires, and he's a replicant, but at the same time has implanted memories that make him have some sort of drive. And I think that's why he needs to have like the OS checks, the checks with the guy. But anyway, he at some point wants to sleep with a real woman. So he brings her home, and interestingly enough, the hologram girlfriend's name is Joi. It was just like very similar to enjoyment or jouissance.
Psychoanalytic. And also a theological term as well.
Yeah, definitely. And what happens is that there's kind of like it's not exactly a threesome, but the hologram is sort of projected or like synthesizes with the real woman, but it's never quite the same. Like there's a phasing issue that happens absolutely. When they're like on top of each other, and
they kind of like do this dance of trying to kind of sync up with each other.
And I think this is the perfect example of there is no sexual relationship.
I know it is. We can't relate to each other directly through sex. I can't remember if I've said this in a different podcast or if it was in the earlier recording of this episode, but there is a slight received wisdom, cliched interpretation of Freud that he's saying that as humans we are just so obsessed with sex and sex is everything, but actually it's more like we can't have sex. Animals can have sex, we can't without some covering over, without some supplemental fantasy. Most people, I think, have sex with their eyes closed. As in like people orgasm with their eyes closed. They're projecting some other image, supplemental image in their mind of whatever fantasy they have, rather than actually being confronted with the physical body of the other.
By the way, what's up with these people that have mirrors on top of their beds? Have you seen this?
I have. I know. I don't know if that,
if I would see myself engaging in a sexual act that would completely ruin it for me. That I couldn't do it.
It's always sometimes seeing even the other person when you're having sex is like, it's weird to see a person.
Which there's something interesting that we're doing in a few months. That we won't talk about it, but yeah.
It's a surprise. No, it's related to fantasy and surplus and sex. Sure. And it's like a short film music video project. But yeah, it is. There's something it's very alienating to see. It's funny, we can watch a film with some very attractive person having sex and it all being very sexy. I think about one of my favorite. We have to do an episode on this, the Thomas Crown affair with Rene Russo and. Oh yeah. Mm-hmm. I don't know why. There's just a very like long sexy. I think I watched that when I was like 9 years old. I was like, ooh. Wow. No, this I won't say sex scene. The sex like scenes. It goes on for quite a long time between segments between Rene Russo and Pierce Brosnan. We can't eat as humans. We can't work. We can't have sex. We have to relate to these things with some kind of supplemental fantasy. Mm-hmm. Food, food should be the simplest thing. If we were just, and this really does kind of elucidate how we are different from animals and why potentially people who are of a psychoanalytic bent would have a problem with evolutionary psychology or Jordan Peterson's comparison of humans to lobsters, because like, if you look at food, humans, if it was just about pure fuel or like desire, fulfilling a desire to eat, we would just not have obesity. We would not have anorexia. We would not have elaborate processes around food. You see, Japan is a very clear example of the kind of ritualization of food. We wouldn't go to restaurants. We wouldn't have birthday parties or Christmas where we like food is such a big thing.
Yep.
If we could work, we wouldn't need like routines and schedules and be paid for it. It's all of these things kind of show that there's something supplemental to being human that is different from us being an animal.
Yeah. Yeah, that's interesting. There's also a great episode. I've never asked you if you like this show, but there's a great episode of Black Mirror where
Black Mirror, yeah.
I think it's it's maybe in the first season or second one, but there's an episode where there's this sort of society that they can revisit their memories and sort of play them on TV. So they have like this kind of chip that is implanted into their brain or their eyes, I don't know, whatever, but it translates whatever the eye receives, and like you can watch it digitally, and you can go back in time, sort of like everything that you experience with your eyes is like recorded, and like the audio as well. But anyway, it's very, very interesting that there's a couple that is having sex. Oh, and by the way, when they're revisiting a memory, their eyes go cloudy, so they don't seem normal. They're having sex and their eyes are cloudy. Yeah. They're not really with each other. They're with their memories, or they're with their fantasies. Like they're too busy to have sex because they're, having sex with their fantasies. And it seemed to me kind of similar to this. Like there's this sort of like impasse between, that doesn't allow for a sexual relationship to be fulfilled. And
it's a very clear expression, because a threesome isn't really an expression. I mean, within the threesome and the idea of like amour couture, and René Girard talks about it a lot, mimetic desire, a kind of a competitive desire for an object creates desire in the other, whatever. But the hologram, it's a really good depiction of this idea of supplemental fantasy. And I know sex is a kind of crazy, interesting, weird topic, and as you say, it's a realm that and I think this is the reason why Freud, it's a realm that expresses all this, the supplementality, the excess of being a person. And it's not because humans are just we've got this obviously we have an id, but we're like monkeys who just want to have sex all the time and everything's about sex. It's like, it's kind of the opposite. I don't actually remember, and you might be able to clarify this, but I don't remember if in the movie anybody else can see Joy, or if it's only him. I know that at some point they can, because
I know that at some point the woman breaks the emanator because like so Joi is projected through
like a projector
some
machine.
kind of projector, but he buys an upgrade, and then I don't know if she then is like a hologram, but only for him.
No,
like,
I think they can. I actually watched this last week. Is there a scene where Love talks to her? Oh God.
Love, yeah. That actress is so good for that role.
So good. So creepy. I honestly can't remember, but yeah, there's a scene also where the like the advert for Joi.
Yeah, because Love works for the company,
the corporation. Yeah,
Weinstein or
Weinstein.
What is it called?
Oh God.
Well, anyway,
yeah. Details.
So she's aware of what an emanator is, but she doesn't ever like. I don't think that anybody ever talks directly to Joi.
Do you know what? I honestly can't answer that question, so it won't.
Well, anyway, it almost doesn't matter, but I think that it becomes like a part of him.
Yeah.
So he's getting closer to being like a human being because he's not interacting with like a physical hologram.
Yeah.
You know, it's kind of Pinocchio in mid-process or whatever. But
it's like the. I never read Northern Lights as a child. I'm becoming a bad person, but they have the diamond. I think this like animal supplement is part of them, but that's obviously not the same thing. But anyway, I don't know why it made me think of that. But
yeah. The other thing that I think that we should touch on is the theme of apocalyptic films.
Yes, dystopia. Why? You answered this so well last time. I think it's a really great point. Why we are so interested in seeing dystopian futures in film. Why there's something pleasurable about seeing a dystopian future rather than just a normal future.
Yeah.
And your insight was really good.
Well, no, I'm indebted to like Mark Fisher and Fred Jameson for this, but I think that the basic idea is that since we are unable to articulate, well, the whole thing that I think Fisher's trying to get at is that there used to be a moment or some kind of pocket in which we could dream of the future and sort of design it in a sense. But now with the conditions of labor that I think that we'll talk more and more of throughout the podcast, but the future is cancelled in a sense.
Yeah.
Oh, by the way, there's also this Bifo Berardi, I think is a philosopher Italian that
yeah.
He's actually the guy that mentioned like that exact phrase, like the future is cancelled, or the slow cancellation of the future. And I think that there's something about dystopian films that are sort of a relief or an escape from having to articulate a future, because it's almost like
it's confirming us
phenomenologically impossible to articulate the possibility of an alternative.
It's like it's comforting to be confirmed in the idea that it's all going to shit, but there's no alternative. If we're confronted with a positive future, it kind of confronts us with the fact that we must take action in the present to change, and we can't. We almost can't. We're so entrapped.
We're so within the shit reality of our lives that our enjoyment has been reduced to not an escape from it, but from a destruction of it. And I think that that's why dystopian films have become like so prevalent. And another thing that we talked about last time was that
so they're comforting rather than frightening. Basically, is the insight.
Yeah. They're extremely comforting. And another thing, it's almost like I think that watching a dystopian film is maybe the same enjoyment that you get from that is the same enjoyment that you get from giving up. So you give up.
So being cynical.
No, not being cynical, but just sort of like, I mean, I think that you experience this when you like up to some kind of task that you don't really want to do because it's really hard, and then you give up on it or it goes away for some reason, and there's some enjoyment that comes from that.
Well, I don't know if this, because I almost think that resignation is an interesting word. There's the idea in Christianity of grace, accepting that you're accepted. It's the step 0 in the 12 steps. Alcoholics Anonymous. You resign, you accept the current situation, and almost, the example of alcoholism, the denial that you have a problem is almost what creates the problem. So resignation in the sense of accepting that you're accepting and giving up can be an extremely positive thing. So I don't know, because I see this dystopian reality in film as like the opposite of that almost, because almost resignation is what has to happen before any real action can be taken.
Yeah, I know exactly what you're talking about, and I think this goes back to the idea of like think, don't act. But I don't necessarily think that that's what dystopian films are doing.
Yeah, I think it's kind of the opposite. Dystopian films are like, are you saying that there could be a transformative possibility in dystopian films
No, I'm saying that because there is no alternative.
Yeah.
People sort of find comfort in the idea of destruction rather than.
Yeah, I mean, there's definitely like death drive.
Yeah,
it is,
but it is sort of like a resignation or a surrender that is enjoyable.
Yeah, because I think they're two different things. The kind of accepting that you're accepted, or accepting the problem, and then I don't know if resignation is the right word, but like. No exit type of resignation versus an open door resignation. I don't know. Yeah, there's something very.
Yeah, this is a perfect segue because go.
Yeah, I was going to say there's something very nice about, there's nothing I can do about it, so what? And I feel like within capitalism, that happens a lot. That people. Well, there's protests that are part of capitalism itself, and then there's kind of like a language, just acceptance and going on with it. But I almost feel that acceptance can be the point of absolute change as well. But I think you're saying something different.
No, I think that's right. It's the giving up is, I think, that what you're talking about, the resignation, and obviously that's enjoyable because it's hard work, I think, to have to articulate some kind of
change is like horrible.
It's a hard work, and I think this is one of the other things, and I think it's a great segue to it. And you don't agree with me. Okay. Or actually, I think that maybe at the end we agreed. But anyway,
about millennials being talentless.
Yeah. So about millennials,
I'm very defensive.
Well, I mean, it's not like it's not some kind of statement that makes me happy. Obviously, there's something very tragic about it, and I don't necessarily think it's a choice that millennials have. It's sort of like a question that is already answered. But I think that I heard somebody say that millennials are the least talented generation, and when I heard it, I was like really put off by it. I didn't like it, but I started to think about it, and if you're upset about something, it's probably because there's some kind of degree of
affect
truth
in you.
Yeah, definitely. And I think that there is something about this idea of the future being canceled that affects art and creativity in a way that millennials, what they want to do and what they have been doing is repeating the past. Yeah. So, we were just talking the other day about like Weezer's doing covers of like Toto.
I don't get that up.
Roy Orbison or whatever. Yeah. And also, I have a few friends that like they're really into just making music that sounds 80s or 70s and is sort of like this exercise in futility of like, nothing is next. Yeah.
Well, I have loads of things to say in response to that. And I wonder whether the term talented is not the right one. I feel like the millennial generation is potentially like the most accomplished within the meritocratic parameters of capitalism. Yeah. I just want to say one caveat before we go on about this discussion is when we're saying, millennials, all this stuff has happened to millennials, that doesn't mean that we are like, as a millennial class, we must da 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 da. And I feel like this is like the logical fallacy of identity politics, that so as a millennial, there are certain contingent factors that have affected the generation, but it doesn't mean that every millennial XYZ and therefore every millennial must. It's just an insight that we just must consider. Yes. Anyway, so I feel like we were brought up in, say, the 90s when we had wealthier parents and childhood became a commodity. So academic achievement in childhood was, so I remember are you doing enough things for your resume when you go to college? Are you doing enough charity work? Do you have enough sporting achievements? Are you good at music? in a way that my parents' generation was just go and play in the garden. There's also, I don't know if it's the same in Mexico, but there's been this received wisdom throughout the ages that every generation is getting stupider, and that, now exams are so much easier. So we have all these public exams in the UK at 16, 17 and 18.
Yeah, bullshit.
And they would say that, and now students, 20% get A stars, therefore all must be easier. And in the past, if you got a C, it was a good grade. No, I don't think they've got stupider. Mm-hmm. People have become better at taking tests and more, quote unquote, educated, and more sacrifices made by the student to achieve high grades. There's so much anxiety amongst Gen Z, and I think it's getting even worse.
I wonder if you think, I mean, you know more about like the whole academic world, but it's like, haven't tests gotten harder ever since Google is a thing?
Sorry?
Haven't tests and exams or whatever gotten harder now that Google is a thing?
Well, no, this is the thing. I definitely don't think that it's got easier. But I think now just what is required to be normal. Now it's something, I don't know if the statistics is right, but I heard like 67% of students in America go to college. That level of achievement for what the reality is of work in the real world. So to get a given job, one must be so much more competitive. Mm-hmm. This inflation, it's not a grade inflation, it's an inflation of what is required. And I have to say that I personally at college worked so hard that I basically had a nervous breakdown at about 22. And I am not alone. I know so many people who are very much within the system who almost killed themselves for academic success, believing that was going to be some guarantor or to buy oneself out of the capitalist system if I kill myself now. But actually, for instance, a friend of mine's dad runs a law firm in London. He told me that when I just graduated, they didn't recruit students from Oxford and Cambridge in the UK. So these are kind of the pinnacle of academic achievement, because the students from those universities were worse employees because they were so burnt out from the start. So we are almost beyond. There's no. I don't like the word balance, but there's so much of an excess focus.
I don't like the word balance.
I don't like the word balance. It has a B and an L in it. It's offensive to me. No, but you know what I mean? I don't like this whole compensatory.
No, of course, yeah.
Because I think there's a dialectic to everything, so it's complicated. But yeah, so in terms of talent, I'm sure millennials are excellent musicians and horse riders and have high grades and well-read and but yeah, it doesn't make us talented. But then talking about production of art and the possibility of being artists and the future being cancelled in relation to art, and also formulating an alternative. Often alternatives emerge in the youth. Yeah. Look at 60s, 70s. One could be an artist in a squat in New York, and you're in the cultural heart, and you're not paying rent, and you're living this very grimy, gritty experience. But in this less than 0 point that millennials are in, it buys you become like a slave. Not only are you a participant in the system, you are a slave of the system. Yep. Debt makes one enslaved. And one of the ways that capitalism has managed to continue despite the antagonisms within it for so long is finding a new way to indebt people. So credit cards, mortgage, car payments, student loans. I mean, the statistic in the UK, the average 20-something earns £8,000 less than their parents did, and the average wage in the UK in your 20s is like low £20,000. Mm-hmm. So the drop is enormous. Yep. Plus, the average graduate in the UK, I have read somewhere, I don't know if it's the correct statistic, has more student debt than the average individual in America. Mm-hmm. Plus the fact that there's no kind of speculative way to make money like houses for baby boomers. So all these factors entrap to such an extent that these young people can't even protest the system. Sure. So I don't know if the talent is the right word, but frustrated might be a word. The most artistically frustrated generation. Yeah. And we should be a generation that's producing amazing things, given the accomplishments and the trained.
But it's all abilities. Going towards sort of like living rather than creation.
Just surviving. And I'm not saying this is the only way to be able to
subsistence
to subsist to be an artist as a millennial, but there are very capitalistic ways, and often one has to consciously or unconsciously identify oneself as an we were talking about identity politics, as a woman artist, or as a no. but in my mind, that's just participating. So, one could argue that identity politics is emergent of capitalism itself.
Yeah.
Rather than just be an artist.
Yeah, a friend of mine sent me a link the other day. I didn't even open it. I was kind of upset when he sent it. Not at him, but just like...
Was that the one you forwarded me on text? The Facebook thing?
Was it? No. This was maybe last month. But he sent me this message, and he's a really good guy, great friend of mine. But he sent me this link that was like a plant-based diet that will help the environment sort of like survive or whatever, like the
like Soylent thing or whatever.
Yeah. And it's like, I was like, this is exactly the problem. The problem is that we have to resort to self-policing and policing others and like creating more strict rules in the way that we live, like limiting our freedom, whatever freedom that we have, even more, so that we feel a sense of control, because a sense of like our sense of agency has been completely taken away ideologically and economically and everything.
Yeah, I know this. It's absolutely almost this lack of a democratic social consensus of looking out for the other, or having a family that can take care of you, or having time to be able to care for each other, results in, and we were talking about delineation, somebody saying as a person of X, Y, Z, all these factors together, these limitations of oneself, rather than a universality of having the time and resources to take care of each other. You're absolutely right, self-policing. And I have heard, I'm not saying that I'm necessarily against veganism, and I think there's plenty of times when it can be useful for people, but it's co-opted as an ideological eating disorder. And eating disorders can be a lot of, for example, I was at a boarding school, and the percentage of girls who have eating disorders in boarding schools, where you are your own self, you have no unconditional love, you must self-police, and it's all about the only kind of recognition that one gets, or quote unquote love, is when one achieves something in a boarding school, when you're kind of removed from your parents and just put in pure school. And eating disorders is a big result of that. Self-policing, self-control. And more than, and what I tell my friends, like I think it's more than 70% of carbon emissions happen because of non-regulated companies that are just like completely destroying the environment. Absolutely, And it's just like, you can try to do the whole plant-based thing, but the sad thing about it is just that like you get to feel like if you're doing something when the reality is that most of the... And it can be a way of actually not taking real action in the world. Absolutely. Yeah. And it's funny because, it's one of these things like co-opted by capital. Absolutely. I know this encroachment of... And policing is another way, And certain forms of protest movements have been co-opted by capitalism, and it's a way almost, you have these corporations that aren't paying tax. So something like Amazon in Ireland or whatever, I mean, Ireland's just a country that I know, or Apple in Ireland, and they have these very woke adverts, and it's almost like a way of dangling "we are the goodies" in front of us, and then just doing things that hundreds of years ago, at a time that we look back on and we think is a really fascistic time, the 1800s or whatever, breaking laws that were in process then. But no, we're nice, we give extra charity, or we're nice, we allow... It's funny, there's a kind of a hipster ice cream shop in LA, but it started in Portland. And the irony is, it's funny because it uses an ingredient that would be illegal in Europe, this like moss that you put in dairy products in America to like creamify it. And when I saw that, I was like, not so organic now. But they had a sign in 2016 on their window that was like, "We welcome gay people, people of color, women, trans people, dogs, anything, it's like, well, of course you do, to spend money." Yep. It's like, it's a brilliant way. And Amazon, just the way they treat their employees, having to wear nappies to go to work. Apple, people throwing themselves off buildings. Globalization is a great way to hide the antagonisms of capitalism, just ship them off elsewhere, the cobalt in our phones from poor children in Congo. But, it's a woke company because it's tech, and Silicon Valley, and meditate at the workplace, and no. It's brilliant. I think I told you this
I sent you this link last month, I think, by Walter Ben Michaels.
Okay.
He did an interview for Yakmin, and what he was talking about is just like, I think actually the article, we can put a link to it. It's like let them eat diversity. Yeah.
It's such a good, yeah. And we don't,
but I mean,
that's not to say that diversity isn't necessary and a brilliant thing, but it's been co-opted.
It's been co-opted, and it depends on how you're looking at diversity that can really backfire.
Yeah, absolutely.
Like, I think the main thing of the article was like, what are we fighting for?
Yeah.
Are we fighting for diversity just because there is a sort of like antagonistic relationship that we have to our own identities and it doesn't matter as much? Or are we fighting just for equal opportunity for exploitation?
Exactly.
So
I mean,
depending on if you're a woman or if you're black or Hispanic or whatever, like, do you just want in on the exploitation? Like, is that...
and one could argue that it's all very well, some privileged person having these critiques that they've been on the inside or whatever, and now it's our turn. But do you want to replace the seats at the table or just turn over the table? And it's much easier to, a protest is a non-dialectical no. It requires within it the structure of the system it's protesting in order to exist. It's like a parasite of the system. Whereas a dialectical no is something that goes right into the grit and grime of the system itself to change it radically. And when you have for instance, there's a women's club in New York that costs thousands of dollars a year to be part of, and it's very expensive. It's a place where you go to work and you spend loads on your avocado toast, and you meet other like-minded women, and you network, etc., etc., etc. If that's what feminism has become, I despair. As in, some people have thousands of dollars a year to spare and live in a cultural center of New York that is extortionate to live in. Lucky you. Lucky you.
Thanks for the data.
I don't think that's not radical, and it's definitely not any kind of certainly being a woman's not easy, but being a man's not easy either. And of course, there's certain things that certainly in America would be beneficial to women, but I just no. But it's funny, you were talking about feeling guilty about going to like expensive restaurants, but it's almost like that kind of feeling of anger at oneself is symptomatic of this. And when you have 26 people who own half the world's wealth, and you have corporations going and having an expensive meal, it's not something that's like
No, and
the privatization of the banking. And
I think it's I mean, it's really sad that people don't see sort of like people see sort of like Venezuela, for example, and whatever their political ideas might represent, as sort of like poverty, and it's not that we're choosing poverty over like extreme inequality, but that's precisely what hasn't been able to be articulated.
But exactly, and hopefully someone like Bernie Sanders can. But I was actually talking to a friend about this very thing, this lumping together, and I think we might have mentioned it earlier today. There's been a real lumping together of terms. Liberalism does not mean what it meant before. Left, when people say, "Oh, left," about a person in America, I immediately know that they mean like absolute conservative who happens to talk about identity politics. But the funny thing as well, we're not at a point that they were in 1917 in Russia, where the poorest country in Europe that was a feudal state had just come out of losing World War One and being coming out of a civil war and having fantastic problems of distribution and having a life expectancy of basically 30. We're not talking about that anymore. Certainly not in the West. And we're also not talking about things that are that extreme. When someone talks about a 70% marginal tax rate, it's almost like the idea, the American dream in America, we were talking about this in terms of La La Land, that this desire not to have a 70% marginal tax rate is because there is some kind of unconscious belief of participants in capitalism that they might be one of those people that one day that might affect because they might be rich, and so they want that possibility. But again, we're talking about acceptance versus resignation. Acceptance, that's not going to be the case. That's where change comes from.
What is this whole kind of like fetishization of extreme wealth? Because don't people get super excited, for example, when like an Avatar movie comes out or an Avengers movie or whatever? Like people get so excited. It's like, I really hope that this movie makes more than $4 billion or whatever. Like well, I mean, how do people just like, I mean, they make a game out of it, and it's like sort of like enjoying their own estrangement from a world that they most likely will not be a part of.
But it's funny because when you talk about those figures, billions, it's almost not real. And the estrangement you feel, you can't even conceive of that number, so it's not a real thing. I don't think it means what it really means.
So you think that this infatuation is sort of like trying to be in on something that is completely ununderstandable for somebody that's making $40,000-$60,000 a year,
$27,000 or 16,000 or
Was there anything else in the movie that we forgot to talk about?
I don't know. I feel like this is it's a heated one. It raises a lot of issues, and it is important. I think that, it points to why we felt it important to add our tiny, insignificant voices to the to this form of argumentation, because I mean, when you actually talk about the realities and the tragedy of how kind of almost close we are to some real change, but how that can all be lost in a moment of misunderstanding and of co-opting of ideas. And when you kind of lump Bernie Sanders together with something like Venezuela, just like, it's not even like, I'm not an expert at all on what's going on in Venezuela, but I'm sure it has less to do with quote unquote socialism than to do with cronyism than to do with mismanagement. It's I think it's just interesting that people are. But I mean, the funny thing is, would we have been in this state if Bernie had won in 2016? But I mean, maybe the person who won in 2016 is all the more reason why Bernie will win in 2020.
I really appreciate the fact that like our episodes are like big Freudian slips, because every single time that we're gonna start an episode, we're just like maybe not. We'll keep it not political. We'll keep it.
I remember that. But the funny thing is, I wouldn't say. Okay, I think we come down on the.
I mean, we're not very
very
political anyway. We don't really talk about politics. For some reason they just come up in the episodes.
Yeah, well, we're polite. We don't talk about sex and politics. So we don't talk about sex a lot. No, but the funny thing is, we talk about sex in like a theoretical way. So we're talking about politics in a theoretical way. Rather than actually like, oh my God, let's go out and
we're
protest.
Not endorsing anybody. We're just like saying that there's certain like theoretical or ideological motifs that come up.
And I would just say that when one is of a certain ideological perspective, then certain things just make sense. But again, there's nothing necessarily wrong with being conservative, and almost a conservative, one could argue, is a more honest position than liberal. Anyway, there you go. Maybe that was too
no. I completely agree with you. I think that's right. The thing is that isn't there a way in which identity politics from liberalism it's just too particular. Like it's way too particular, and it used to be that universal sort of the possibility of a universality belonged to the left, and now it's not like that anymore. It's sort of been like divided into like.
You see the reason why I think we've said in previous podcasts that liberal and conservative are not even conservative. It's a type of conservative, are two sides of the same coin. They play identity politics on both sides, and that I was actually watching yesterday on YouTube. There's a critique that Hillary Clinton was making this year of Bernie Sanders and this idea of the Bernie bro. It's like these generalized critiques that one throws at each side, and when you say a term, it encompasses this kind of person, this kind of person, this kind, and you immediately throw everything out. I think it's from like a lack of a democratic social consensus where you can be with your fellow man, and actually you're a member of a society rather than completely out for yourself. And then also a lack of ability to express oneself or to want to hear another position. But I think this comes back to the dystopia. It's more comforting to be absolutely sure in your position that there's no other alternative than to actually be open to the idea that change is possible.
Yeah, definitely. I absolutely agree. So, great film, right?
Well, I don't know how much. Yeah, maybe we should just spend like 1 minute at the end saying how artistically fantastic this film is. Tell me about, you were telling me about the score. You were talking
the
to
composer,
some,
so Johan Johansson died, I think, last year. And it was really sad. I think he was one of the few composers that was really doing something that was like, it packed a big punch, I think. It was he was doing stuff that was very sort of like unusual for. And it's interesting that when he died, he got sort of replaced by one of the guys that is maybe kind of doing something that is kind of, good things, but at the same time, just very sort of like familiar.
So he had composed the score, and for whatever reason, his score didn't fit and so they, I
think Villeneuve decided to go with, I think it's Hans Zimmer together with Benjamin Wallfisch, and they did the soundtrack. It's okay. I didn't think it was like the greatest thing, but they only had a few months to do it anyway. So
it definitely had echoes of the original score, but it didn't stand out to me as anything like.
I think if they would have done something like kind of similar to Arrival, like what he did for Arrival was like amazing, or even for Sicario was like very good.
I love them. You grew up in Ciudad Juarez.
Yeah, I grew up in Juarez and El Paso. I think ever since I was like from like 5 to.
We should do an episode on Sicario.
14, 15. Yeah. We should also maybe do Black Museum from Black Mirror. I don't know, maybe. Yeah,
we should do an episode. And we should do Thomas Crown Affair 90s version. Rene Rousseau.
Oh yeah,
style. Well, that
I remember my mom seeing that
icon.
film when I was growing up. Yeah, but I've never seen it. Yeah.
It's funny because I probably saw it when I was like 9 years old or something. And there's a scene where she comes in with this like green juice and like, and I remember thinking like how weird. Then I totally became one of those people that's like green juice. Although I don't drink any of that stuff now. There was a period of my time when I was just like down spiralina. But she does her clothes in that film so good. But it's something like crap about 90s style, but also like really compelling.
Yeah, definitely. All right.
Anyway,
so I think that was about it, right?
I think so. That from my notes that I jotted down briefly, I think we covered everything.
All right.
And but we didn't really. Well, this podcast isn't about critiquing on an artistic level. So yeah, it's fine.
Sounds
we
good.
did the job. Okay.
Alrighty.
Goodbye.
Bye.